Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at some of my older reviews and bring them up to my more current quality standards. Today we're taking a look at Call of Duty World at War for PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Wii. What you see here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by Treyarch and published by Activision in November of 2008, and it's the sort of follow-up to Call of Duty 4 because it's based mostly on that engine as well as the gameplay style of Call of Duty 4, although it obviously has no relation to it in terms of plot. What you should really take it as is the predecessor to the Call of Duty Black Ops sub-series, because Black Ops actually has plot elements that derive from World at War, which means that you basically had two storylines going on simultaneously with the Call of Duty series. You had Call of Duty 4's storyline, which began with 4 and then ended with Modern Warfare 3, and then you had the World at War storyline, which is still going as of Black Ops 3. This is also the first game in the series to feature the Zombies mode, and obviously it's not the last one because it was very popular with World at War players. In fact, World at War in general received a pretty good reception on its release, with most people praising the multiplayer as an extension of what Call of Duty 4 was doing, so it was kind of fresh and exciting, as well as the introduction of the Pacific Theater to the World War II Call of Duty entries, and the simple fact that this is the first game in the series to actually be legitimately gory. You can blast limbs off with the explosives and the shotguns and such like that, so it's supposedly portraying the horror of war really well, at least according to critics of the time. But let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out exactly how it is, first off as a first-person shooter, next as a Call of Duty game, and more importantly, how it treats the Pacific Theater because it's the first World War II entry in the series to actually feature it. Well, as far as presentation goes, the first thing you'll notice is that this is brown and gray and realistic. Although there is actually a third color, and that's red. It's the red of the blood and gore that is splattered all over the place in this game. But other than that, you're dealing with a hell of a lot of brown and gray, and not much else. Even the jungles don't look green. Apparently, Treyarch seems to think there is no such thing as a color other than brown and gray unless it involves blood and guts, so you end up suffering through that the entire game. It ends up looking incredibly ugly as a result, even though the actual visual quality is fairly solid. I mean, in terms of pure visual quality, it's about on the same level as Call of Duty 4. There's a lot of detail packed into the environments. It's just a shame that you can't really get past the color scheme. Of course, this was just one of many games around that time period that was embracing this incredibly idiotic color scheme, where they seem to think it means that the game is going to be gritty and realistic, when in reality it just looks awful. And speaking of awful, there's just certain aspects of the visuals that just look downright terrible, like the FG42 if your FOV is anything higher than 65. Obviously on PC you can raise the FOV, on the single player you can raise it up quite a lot, on the multiplayer you can raise it up to 80. Even if you raise it up to 80, it actually clips out. The back part of the gun, right before it hits the stock, actually just cuts off entirely and it just floats there. It looks terrible. Of course, at this point, you're going to go, but DW, you're not supposed to see that because the game is supposed to be rendered at 65 FOV. Well, too bad. Rendering at 65 degree FOV does not give them an excuse for being incredibly lazy. Not rendering much detail on the side of the gun that you're never actually going to see in the first-person animations, I can understand. Not rendering a full third of the gun entirely just doesn't make any sense. And it's not like the FG42 is the only gun that has rendering issues. Plenty of other ones have animation rendering issues, namely things like the Thompson. If you go past 65 FOV, you can see them just pull the magazine out and just let it sit there for a moment before sticking it back in, which, hell, you can actually see that on the 65 degree FOV sometimes as well. And there's even clipping issues on the reload for the M1 Garand of all things. You can actually see, if you use the reload before the clip is actually expended, that the bolt will actually clip through the receiver. And that's not with me messing around with the FOV, it just does that, and it looks terrible. It's actually kind of baffling just how all over the place the visuals are, and when you get to the sound design, things are really no different. You have sound effects that are just frankly terrible. All of the explosions are way too weak, none of the guns actually sound like proper guns, and that's even by Call of Duty standards, so they've really failed on that regard. But things really heat up when you hit the voice acting, namely with regards to Gary Oldman's character, who is Viktor Reznov. He is completely over the top, and you can really tell that Gary Oldman had a lot of fun doing that role, and it's actually pretty infectious once you get into the game. It's just a shame that the rest of the voice acting is just alright. It does have Kiefer Sutherland in it, and he does a decent enough job, but he's just nowhere near as ridiculous as Gary Oldman is as Reznov, so he's just not anywhere near as memorable. But the one bit that is memorable across the board is the soundtrack. This one really sticks out in the entire Call of Duty series because it's not the typical World War II orchestral soundtrack, and it's not really anything like what would later come in the series either. It's a pretty weird amalgamation of choral arrangements with these various orchestral arrangements, electronic music, and even hard rock guitar, and at times it's actually pretty frickin' awesome. There's only one really big problem with it, and it's something that permeates the entirety of the game. And it's something that I mentioned in my Black Ops 3 review. Treyarch seems to think that war is in and of itself really frickin' awesome, and they do their best to make you feel like a total badass for blasting a dude's arm off with a shotgun before roasting his buddies with a flamethrower and watching them scream in agony for several seconds before they finally die. In other words, Treyarch has a violence and brutality fetish that goes back at least as far as World at War. I don't know about Call of Duty 3 because I haven't played it yet, but given that it got the T rating, I can't really see it being too big on the violence and brutality thing. The thing is that while in Black Ops 3 it just comes across as incredibly tasteless, in World at War it's all over the place. You get the feeling like they were trying to say war is hell, and thus the way to show that is to make this brutal and gritty and violent and everything like that. But at the same time, the soundtrack is basically telling you how much of a badass you are for perpetrating acts of brutality, and it's just this really weird feeling you get while playing it. And while a decent chunk of that is in the visuals and in the sound design, the vast majority of this is in its story and gameplay. And of course the story in this game is just World War II, but it's two specific theaters of World War II. You have the American campaign set in the Pacific, and you have the Russian campaign set on the Eastern Front. So basically they're just beating a dead horse with the Russian campaign, and they are trying something a bit different with the American campaign. The problem is that both of these campaigns are actually kind of a disaster, but for different reasons. The one thing it doesn't do is give any real regard for the common soldier like the previous Call of Duty games did. Instead, it focuses on a handful of characters and basically makes the story about them. The problem with that is that instead of actually doing character stories, what they decided to do was just throw you into a bunch of action set pieces as player one and expect you to think that it was the best thing ever. The thing is that while you can kinda sorta get behind that in the Russian campaign because the Russian campaign is completely over the top and ridiculous, when you're playing the American campaign, it actually feels mildly insidious. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that the opening sequence of the American campaign shows a Japanese officer putting out a cigarette in a fellow GI's eye before he has his underling slit the guy's throat and come after you next. It's the tone setter for the rest of the American campaign, where it basically treats the Japanese as pure evil that should be vanquished by any means possible, especially if that method is very slow and very agonizing, and the game basically relishes in handing you a flamethrower or Molotovs or things like that to burn your enemies alive. The thing is that while that sort of thing can work in a game like, say, Soldier of Fortune, which doesn't take itself remotely seriously and is just like, yeah, we're completely over the top, just deal with it. In this, the American campaign in particular feels like it's trying to be deadly serious, and it ends up coming across as outright racist in turn. Meanwhile, when you jump over to the Russian campaign, it does demonize the living hell out of the Germans, but at the same time, it doesn't take itself quite as seriously, and you can actually just kind of get wrapped up in how completely over the top and ridiculous it is, so it actually works okay in that regard. You see what I mean by this game is kind of conflicting in terms of the feelings that it gives you. On the one hand, the Russian campaign is just a lot of ridiculous nonsense that is surprisingly entertaining, and then you get to the American campaign, and it's actually kind of uncomfortable to play, not because it's gritty and realistic and oh my god, the war is terrible, but rather that it's actually kind of insulting. But of course it really doesn't help that the game feels incredibly derivative. I mean, some scenes are pretty much ripped directly from movies like, say, Enemy at the Gates. But it's even derivative of other Call of Duty games. I mean, you stormed the Reichstag in the original Call of Duty, and now you're storming it again in World at War, because of course you are, for reasons. But even when you get to basic things, like the level design, it ends up just being incredibly bland and generic. You go into these levels and you can very easily tell that they are video game levels and they're not modeled after any real-world location or even attempting to make them look like a real-world location. The thing about video game levels, particularly levels in games like this one, is that the levels are not supposed to feel like they are from a video game. They're supposed to feel like viable real-world locations, and what you end up with in this is obvious video game levels that just drag on and on. Particularly if you're playing on veteran difficulty, because then the AI is completely over-the-top ridiculous, where they'll throw grenades at you constantly for no discernible reason, and you will, needless to say, get incredibly frustrated at that. That said, the AI in and of itself is not particularly impressive. In fact, it's pretty dumb when you get down to it. They will regularly just charge you for no discernible reason, making it incredibly easy to pick them off. And the only things that really make it more challenging are the fact that the enemies all blend into the environment. The Germans all blend into the gray of pretty much every environment they're in, while the Japanese are, of course, blending in with their jungle environment, and it ends up getting incredibly irritating to deal with sometimes. And then when the game gives you a bit of a reprieve from just doing that, it's basically throwing you into a turret segment that you've done many, many times before, even in other Call of Duty games. And the distinct lack of variety in both campaigns means that the campaign is one of the weaker ones in the Call of Duty series, whether you're talking about the American or the Russian campaigns, or both combined. It's not anything remotely resembling the careful masterpiece that was the original Call of Duty, and even the well-intentioned but mechanically messy Call of Duty 2, or the really, really good Call of Duty 4. It's just bland and uninteresting, and if it weren't for the sheer amount of brutality in the game, it wouldn't really stand out among any other World War II shooters. Where it does stand out, however, are the multiplayer modes, one of which is the co-op campaign, which is just the campaign, only you can play with 2 people, so really, why bother with it? And then, of course, there's the Zombies mode, which is the cooperative defense game where you go up against waves and waves and waves of zombies until everybody dies. You can, of course, get weapons from the walls with the cache that you develop over the course of the game, whether you're killing zombies or building barriers or whatever it may well be. And, of course, you can open up other areas of the map which will have access to different weapons and things like that. You'll get access to the various objectives that will allow you to continue the match instead of just sitting there killing zombies. And in general, it's just kind of a joke mode. It's something they threw in just to have it as something ridiculous, and it worked out okay for them because it actually became more popular than the single-player campaign. Gee, I wonder why. Frankly, I find the whole concept of the Zombies mode incredibly dull, but that's because zombies in general bore the living hell out of me. If zombies are your kind of thing, then you might actually get quite a bit of fun out of the Zombies mode. But if the multiplayer style of Call of Duty 4 is more up your alley, then that's what you'll find in the multiplayer for World at War as well. There's only one really big problem with that. That style of gameplay just doesn't work very well for World War II. And while Treyarch did do what they could to make that work, ultimately it ends up coming across as an incredibly jumbled mess of multiplayer. You still have create a class, you still have rank-based unlocks, you still have a variety of weapons that you unlock over time and you can unlock attachments for, which is rather amusing when you get to things like the aperture sight, which is an obvious replacement for the red dot sight, only it's just a piece of glass with a crosshair painted on it. which of course screams, look at this, it's incredibly lazy. You've got perks that you unlock over time that are pretty much the same as they were in Call of Duty 4, with some slight exceptions here and there. You have a variety of different grenade types you can throw at things, you have special weapons you can throw at things, and kill streaks make a return, with the 3 kill streak being a recon plane, obvious UAV, the 5 kill streak being, instead of an airstrike, an artillery barrage, even though it's the same thing, and the 7 kill streak not being a helicopter, but rather attack dogs. And there goes their PETA endorsement. But on a more serious note, the attack dogs are more of a mild annoyance than anything else. They really don't get you that many kills, honestly. They're pretty easy to take out. The artillery barrage really isn't all that effective, and the UAV substitute just does what the UAV did in Call of Duty 4, which is useful, but ultimately just kind of underwhelming. What is rather amusing about them are the announcers, because on the Russian side you end up with Gary Oldman's Reznov being ridiculous, and when you're playing as the Japanese you get this incredibly over-the-top racist caricature, ranting about how the enemy team is savages that are sending dogs to do their work, or how our artillery will force them into submission, and that sort of thing, and honestly that's way more amusing than it has any right to be. But once you get past that, you find that the maps aren't very well designed in this thing. They don't flow very well and ultimately end up being more of a mess than anything else. The actual gunplay is kind of a mess because they threw bolt-action rifles into the mix, which don't really fit very well when the MP40 is as ridiculously overpowered as it is. Although in this footage you may not see that because a lot of people just stopped using the MP40 because it was so good that it just got boring. Hell, you can see me using bolt-action rifles in this thing all the time just because I actually like using them as opposed to using, say, the submachine guns where I feel like they're actually kind of overpowered. But if that doesn't float your boat, then maybe you'll take a stab at the modes that actually introduce tanks. Yes, tanks are back in World at War in certain maps and certain modes, and they actually are pretty infuriating sometimes. Not because they're ridiculously overpowered, but rather because they're actually pretty easy to defeat, and there's really not much reason for getting in one. Yes, the tanks in this game are actually more of a liability than an asset. Don't worry, I'm just as baffled as you are. At any rate, the general consensus you will find is that after having played Call of Duty 4, this feels like a rehash in pretty much the worst way possible. It tries to shoehorn in World War II with this gameplay style that just doesn't work very well for it, and what you end up with is a mess of a game in all respects. The single player is half and half. Half of it, the American campaign, is a complete disaster, while the Russian campaign, the other half of it, is so ridiculously over the top you can't help but at least have some fun with it. Meanwhile, the zombies mode is going to be completely hit or miss for you, and when you get to the multiplayer, it's just all over the place. It feels like a complete rehash of Call of Duty 4's multiplayer, only it doesn't work anywhere near as well, and the map design isn't anywhere near as good. On top of that, this is where the series started to really suffer from balancing issues, and they didn't really sort those out until the original Black Ops. This is also the last game in the series until you hit the original Black Ops to feature a server browser with dedicated community servers rather than matchmaking with peer-to-peer like was in Modern Warfare 2 and Modern Warfare 3, and of course later on in Ghosts and Advanced Warfare. It is interesting to note that the Treyarch titles in the series, at least for PC, have always used dedicated servers even if they haven't used a server browser though. This one and Black Ops both use a server browser, whereas Black Ops 2 and 3 both use matchmaking but still have dedicated servers at least. This also marks the first Treyarch game to be released on PC, and it really does show because on launch it was kind of a disaster. It took quite a few rather large patches to really bring this thing up to be what it is today, which is at best kind of serviceable, but mostly a very underwhelming experience. It's kind of funny, after the blockbuster success that was Call of Duty 4, we pretty much expected more of that, and what we got was, unfortunately, more of that, only not as good. And the fact that more people still continue to play Call of Duty 4 than World at War really does speak volumes. Although you still actually can get into games online on PC in this, which is pretty impressive. It's just a shame that there's really not much reason to do it unless you're just a diehard Call of Duty fan or you just, for some baffling reason, really like Treyarch. Ultimately, I give this a 2.5 out of 5. Those of you who've seen the original review will know that that is indeed a lower score than what I gave it in the original review. Still didn't give it a particularly high score in that, but when I get to this and I look back on just how much of a mess this game is and how baffling it is that I actually managed to have some fun in it, the decision is really clear. Thanks for watching.